Good afternoon. Welcome to Chatham House. Well, welcome to London Climate Action Week at Chatham House. So I'm Anna Yang. I'm the Executive Director of Chatham House Sustainability Accelerator. So welcome to the event Beyond Hopium and Doomism. I love the name. So just before I hand over to Laurie and our amazing panel of speakers, I'll just do a very quick intro about Chatham House. Some of you will know about us, others won't. So our mission is to help governments and societies build a sustainable, secure, and a just world. We were founded following the Paris Peace Agreement in 1920, so we just turned 102 years old. And to celebrate our centenary 2 years ago, our second century work is focused on three goals: sustainable and equitable future, peaceful and thriving society, accountable and inclusive governance. And just to put a bit of a context, the accelerator was then launched last year, part of this forward-looking second century, with the objective to accelerate one of these pillars, which is the sustainable and equitable future. We harness Chatham House research capability combined with action and solutions, and we have broadly three objectives: mainstream and accelerate sustainability solutions, take the future, bring the future into the present, so focus on the long term, focus on intersection of emerging trends with sustainability. And then the third thing is enlarge the space for stakeholders to interact with us. So we host space to connect, to think, for people to come together. And the reason why we have, when Laurie came as a visiting fellow, is because this is so close to my heart and also to everybody from our team, which is we need to enlarge the space for the next generation and the next generation to be part of the conversation much earlier. Like, it took me anyway, I'm not going to get into detail. It took me a while to get to where I am, and I don't think that the younger generation, we can't wait. So, and this is why we're so keen to have Laurie with us and also with this event. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And welcome from me to Chatham House. My name is Laurie. I'm a visiting fellow at the Sustainability Accelerator at Chatham House. I'm also a visiting fellow at the Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter, who are also co-hosting this event. And we were supposed to have someone there from there today who wasn't able to make it here. The Global Systems Institute is a site of expertise on how rapid destructive changes can happen to the natural world, but also how very rapid positive changes can happen in societies as well. These sort of tipping points can be both bad and they can be both good. We're here today with a fantastic, very esteemed panel, two of whom are in the room with me here, two of whom are online, and we'll go to their remarks soon. We're talking today about quite a difficult topic. We're talking about how the environmental crisis, not just the climate bit, the overall environmental crisis, is already a global disaster in many respects, already a global tragedy. It will get worse. Hopefully how much worse it gets will be attenuated by rapid emergency action on mitigation, adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. But the destabilization that will result, that's already resulting but could increase into future, could have an impact on our ability to drive the transition itself. So how we navigate a challenging future, how we can accelerate the transition to a more sustainable, more equitable, more resilient world, while also managing the destabilization resulting from the environmental crisis, is what I want us to be talking about today. Bit of housekeeping before I introduce the panel and then give a bit more framing for this event. This is a public event. It is on the record, so the Chatham House rule is not in effect right now. We do have a hashtag. It's the London Climate Action Week hashtag, which you can see on the screens, LCAW 2022. This is part of that week's worth of events. And if you've got any questions, do think them up, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion after we've had our panelists. And to our panelists then, we have a fantastic group with us. Online, we have Loretta Heber-Girardet, who is Chief of the Risk Knowledge Monitoring and Capacity Development Branch at the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, the UNDRR. And some of you may have come across their global assessment report, which they released recently, that I'm sure Loretta is going to be speaking to in a moment. We've got Dr. Thierry, who, very interesting journey, started out as an Earth systems scientist, then turned activist, and now back into academia as a researcher at the University of Cardiff and looking at how the science is used by activists. And then our very own Nina Jeffs, who is an Academy Fellow at our Chatham House Leadership Academy here, a member of the Environment and Society Programme, and as I'm sure you're going to, your work focuses on the intersection of gender inclusion and climate action with a particular focus on China. So we've got a brilliant group of people. They're going to do some very short provocations to get us started, which I'll hand them over to do in a minute, and then I want us to have some questions and discussion, because I think this is a really important subject matter that is not discussed enough among the environmental movement, among some of the conversations that might be happening at London Climate Action Week. But before I do that, I'd like to just to frame the discussion, just introduce some ideas around the work that I'm doing. I'm running a project called Cohort 2040, and that work has kindly been given a bit of a temporary home by the Sustainability Accelerator here. I came to this work because I've been in the kind of climate policy space for a while. I'm at the beginning of my 30s now, so very much having transitioned out of what I guess you would describe as a youth cohort. But I was very aware that when we were having discussions about driving the transition, people who are my generation or younger would have to be driving it in a future in which we would have the repercussions of the failure to have driven it hard and fast enough to date, right? The median age of a person on Earth now is about 31 years old, which is almost how old I am. It happens to be that the average age of a world leader is about 62. So those median age people will, some of them, are already in leadership positions in different respects. But to be senior leaders everywhere, they might have to live their lives again, right? Before they're at that 62 age that the current world leaders are. And that could be a very different world to the one we see now. A world that is suffering even more acutely under the failure to have gone on top of the environmental crisis to date. Why do I think that? Well, if you look at the latest IPCC work, about 96% of the scenarios that the IPCC looks at say there will be some kind of overshoot at 1.5 degrees. There's a huge amount of assumptions that are built into that, including that we will have to roll out vast amounts of negative emissions technologies to suck carbon out of the atmosphere into the future. That's a bewildering challenge to comprehend. We've missed globally all of the biodiversity targets that were set in 2010 over a 10-year period to 2020. And the sort of forgotten twin UN process to the climate one, the biodiversity COP process, is struggling at the moment to try and get us towards a new set of effective targets. We are seeing potentially worse impacts from the climate crisis than we may have expected at current temperature levels. And we have still got high levels of vulnerability and exposure to the subsequent impacts. And in some ways, that vulnerability and that exposure is growing globally. Sometimes I feel like, at least over the course of my life, the way the struggle to tackle the environmental crisis has been framed is it's like we're on a flotilla of ships, right? And there's a storm on the horizon. And people have been warning for a long time that we need to incrementally change the bearing of the ships, and then we will steer around the storm, right? And some, sure, are closer to the storm than others and feeling the effects, but we can do this, we can win. But that didn't happen, and we're now increasingly into the storm. And when you're in the storm, you have to steer out, so it doesn't overcome you. But your ability to steer can be impacted by the storm hitting the boat, right? And when it comes to the environmental crisis, those destabilizing effects could include the list that we always see in high-level reports. Impacts on the food system, the cascading systemic risks that we warn about here at Chatham House, the knock-on implications for migration, for political extremism, for international cooperation, some of which we're seeing now in the context of the chaos brought by COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think it's a difficult conversation to have, this one, of kind of what the strategy is as we head out into the future. Partly because the future is, of course, uncertain, because it's complex, but I think also because the strategic communications necessity that we all face to say we can do this, we have 12 years to save the world, we've got 8 years, we can still do this, can sometimes stop us from having that more difficult conversation. I think another thing is the potential for moral hazard, that if we talk about the kind of things that we may need to do in a more unstable, uncertain world, it could give cover to people to continue to emit now, for example, or to focus overtly on adaptation instead of focusing on mitigation. And I think it's difficult emotionally, because it's a very scary prospect, particularly if you are of any age, but below a certain age, to think about that kind of inheritance into the future. But that's the reality where we are. And I think sometimes as people face up to it, they slip either side into our hopium, to use a phrase coined by Mary Heglar, the climate justice writer in the US, to describe a kind of hysterical, unfounded optimism, often based on sort of techno silver bullets, or then a fatalistic doomism that can often border on the misanthropic. Today we want to talk about how we can go beyond those, to craft a kind of strategy in which we can anticipate how to drive the transition to a better world as the consequences of the failure to do so to date begin to bring themselves to bear even more. So that's the subject matter I'd love for us to have in our minds today. We're going to get some initial provocations from our panel, who are all legendary in their ability to fit their provocations into about 3 to 5 minutes, and you can mark them on their progress to do that in a second. And I would like us to start online, and I would like us to start with Loretta, who's going to give us some idea of the fantastic work that she and others are doing at UNDRR, and we've asked her to be here today. We're very privileged for her to be here today because they are doing fantastic work that looks at that destabilization and our vulnerability and exposures globally today. So Loretta, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And I have to say the title Hopium and Doomism really attracted me to this session, because at UNDRR, we really believe that understanding risk is the foundation to better addressing it and better managing it, and perhaps not slipping into either the hopium or doomism. Unfortunately, there isn't much investment, or not enough investment in really understanding the risks that we face. And so our GAR, which is really the Global Assessment Report on Risk for the UN system, very much is around the idea that we need to change the way the global community manages risks. So if I could just go to the very first slide, just very briefly, and this is no surprise to any of you who are working on climate, the current trends really point to an increase in the number of disaster events fueled by climate change. But at the same time that these disaster events are being fueled by climate change, the vulnerability and the exposure is also growing. And this has to do with poverty, it has to do with unplanned rapid urbanization. And where we're really seeing this have the greatest impact is through these high frequency, low intensity, but very, very regular events at the community and the local level. So I won't go into all the details about the disaster trends that we're seeing, but the news isn't good. Maybe we have to acknowledge that there is, with the current trajectory of 1.5 degrees, little doubt that the number of disaster events will continue to increase. And we are not in a strong enough position to prevent these disaster events. So ultimately, what is needed are new approaches, and there are new approaches that can be followed, and perhaps this is a bit where the hopium comes through. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Some of the concepts that we're really trying to socialize is that disasters are socially constructed processes, that yes, it's true that the hazards are becoming more intense and more frequent due to climate change. However, it's really those complex interactions between the human and the natural spheres that are leading to the losses and damages being incurred. And this is down to human choices and a lack of investment in risk reduction. What we are seeing is disaster impacts cascading from one system or sector to another. And when this happens, pre-existing inequality and vulnerability is amplifying these negative impacts. I think the other point that we really would like to make here, and using the example of Bangladesh, is that when we think about the cost of disasters, we tend to only think about the direct impacts of heat waves and storms, but we're not necessarily really looking at the indirect impacts. And here, this is an example from a recent study in Bangladesh, which is looking at the direct impacts in terms of economic dimensions on women's vulnerability during cyclones that pointed to increased unemployment, decreased livelihood options, increased poverty, increased food security, loss of property. But also these indirect and longer lasting impacts, such as early marriage, migration, long-term displacement. So understanding these cascading impacts is critical. And we haven't invested enough in this. And another concept that we'd really like to socialize is that ensuring greater resilience is a core element for these transition strategies towards a safer and more sustainable future for all. Because resilience building addresses not only the impacts of the climate emergency, but also the environmental crises and the ecosystems degradation. And this is what's leading us to these tipping points in our Earth systems. So one way to better address systemic risk and to build resilience is to develop scenarios that assess the full extent, the full range of cascading and compounded risks and indirect disaster losses. Part of the challenge we're seeing, if we could go to the next slide, is that we tend to only rely on economic metrics. But this actually leads us to highlight interventions as successful only if they protect high value areas rather than high vulnerability areas. So we need to really invest in better metrics that can measure the number of years of life saved, for example, which is calculated in the public health sphere, to better understand the broader impacts across sectors. And this is just a very brief example in Barbados, where they have done some work on understanding the cascading economic impacts of hurricanes that really looks beyond direct impacts, but looking at the full range of impacts across multiple sectors and different scenarios. So my last slide, because I recognize that I'm probably out of time, is that we need to review how we're managing risk, undoubtedly. And we have three main recommendations for policymakers. First is that we need to start to measure what we value. And that really means to take into account things such as, for example, the Netherlands Bank became the first ever central bank to consider biodiversity, for example, a financial risk. And it found that 36% of the portfolio values of the Dutch financial institutions were exposed to nature-related risks. So addressing systemic risks means applying metrics that reflect economic, but also planetary and societal health. And when systems are not collecting the right data, these assets are undervalued in decision-making, and we're losing real opportunities. Our current measurement systems are too focused on the short term, and they really fail to consider these cascading impacts. Our second message is that we need to better understand how people make decisions about risk. And we show that decisions that are made around disasters are often really influenced by short-term thinking or other motivated reasoning. So we need to build that into how we actually design programming. It's the cognitive biases about risks that are not actually being taken into account. And finally, we need to reconfigure our governance and financial systems to work better across silos. And we need to start designing these in consultations with people who are affected by climate and disaster risks. And we know that today's world is extremely complex. We are seeing the destabilization of global ecosystems through climate change. And therefore, we really need to ensure that our 21st century institutional cultures become much more agile and flexible. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rosa. I'm going to hand this next to Jessie, who, as I said, is the Executive Secretary of this new Global Overshoot Commission. I think it's a very interesting example of an effort to explore how, alongside mitigation action, we need to think about strategies if we possibly head to and beyond 1.5. So, Jessie, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you for the opportunity and to join this conversation. I too find the contrast and the path between hope and a sense of doom in the climate change conversation to be both fascinating and challenging. As a data point, a study came out almost a year ago now, surveying climate anxiety among young people in 10 countries, I believe, across the world. And if the figures there were any reflection of reality, it's really quite stark, with majorities across these 10 countries believing that humanity is doomed and the things that they value most will be destroyed. And that's clearly worrying, both the beliefs, but also the impacts that it can have on people's well-being. And at the same time, there is a certain sense of hope that's not necessarily around silver bullet technologies as has been framed, but in the sense that we must be able to stay within the Paris Agreement targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius warming by emissions cuts alone. And according to the statements of the IPCC, overshoot of at least 1.5 degrees is, the term they used is almost inevitable. And we're currently on path to overshoot 2.0 degrees as well. But I think charting a path between that sense of doom and the optimism or faith in the capacity of emissions cuts alone to limit climate change is the fact that there are other means to reduce climate change and its risks. These are accelerating adaptation, removing carbon dioxide from the air, or net negative or negative emissions, as was introduced earlier, and as well as the prospect of slightly of reflecting a small portion of incoming sunlight to the Earth to artificially cool the planet and reduce some forms of climate change. So the project that I have helped organize, and for which I'm the executive secretary, called the Climate Overshoot Commission. It's an independent group of eminent global leaders who will recommend an integrated strategy to reduce climate risks should global warming goals be exceeded. And it's globally diverse and independent and authoritative figures, including former presidents and prime ministers, national ministers, former heads of intergovernmental agencies, leaders from the environmental community, etc. And the process will be one of a series of meetings leading to a set of an integrated governance strategy that considers the potential limitations, risks, and costs of these additional measures to reduce climate change. The idea and the motivation being, we all agree that emissions cuts must remain the top priority, but perhaps at the margin, there's significant value could be added by looking seriously at these additional needs. And it can be a difficult conversation to acknowledge that we may not, that we're likely, in fact, to not reach our goal through the means that we intended. So the recommended strategy should be ready, will be ready, in fact, in late summer 2023, with an eye towards informing the global stocktake at that year's UN Climate Change Summit. And you can find information at overshootcommission.org. I look forward to further conversation today. Thank you.
Right, I'm going to bring us onto our panel here in person, and I'm going to hand over to our very own Nina for your reflections. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. This has been really interesting so far. I wanted to speak about the present and the future. In the present, this conversation around, doomism, I particularly see, there's a reason for people kind of pushing that narrative, and it's to conjure up a sense of urgency. The idea that we have 8 years to save the world, we have a deadline rapidly approaching, and some of us needed a rapidly approaching deadline to get things done. So I appreciate that, but I also think we're often presented with a false trade-off in the present between urgency and equity and justice, especially in processes and procedures. So the idea that because this is climate change mitigation is an urgent issue, sort of inclusion in the processes of how decisions about that are made sort of is a delay, maybe it's red tape, and that maybe we can do away with it. Whereas I think actually it's important to push back on that, because social buy-in to the huge sort of socioeconomic transitions that will be needed to really tackle this environmental crisis head on, in countries like the UK in particular, is really important. And actually, if you don't manage that transition in a way that's equitable, that brings the most, the groups that have the most to lose to the conversation, or people who might be disproportionately impacted by, for example, energy price rises, people will start to turn against that transition, and you won't have the long-term political buy-in that's needed. And we've seen that, for example, in the Yellow Vest protests in France, when those kind of procedures weren't followed. But there are also plenty of positive examples around the world of how this kind of thing has been done. For example, when Indonesia removed fossil fuel subsidies, they did a lot of consultation. They reinvested that into poverty reduction initiatives. And there are a lot of examples of these kind of approaches that need to be considered. Looking ahead to 2040, shall we say, or sort of the future, I think Loretta did an amazing job of laying out how when we think about the impacts of climate change, it's not just the direct ones, but the systemic ones, which have sort of broader social impacts. Chatham House last year released a climate change risk assessment report, which outlined some of the systemic risks of climate change, which will particularly affect climate vulnerable countries, which include forced migration, conflict, increased poverty and inequality, social and political instability. And of course, those are really scary thoughts. And we know that those impacts will disproportionately affect groups within those countries that are most marginalized. So, for example, women working in the informal sector often don't have access to social protection. So if there's a massive energy price rise, how does that affect their small business? On all of those levels, we need to think sort of within countries and how to protect the most affected people. And also thinking ahead sort of strategically, there will be spillover effects of that instability and conflict that will also affect politics in developed countries, like we've seen, for example, with migration in the past. We need to be thinking about that and how we'll address it. And we also need to acknowledge that, if countries are constantly experiencing extreme weather events, sea level rise and all of this kind of thing, that this affects their capacity to continue with mitigation and adaptation. And we need to look at what kind of international cooperation and solidarity is possible to actually support with not only dealing with those impacts, but moving forward on action as well. So just to conclude, equity and justice is a moral imperative, but a practical one as well, now and in the future. And I think the most recent IPCC report on impacts, adaptation and vulnerability actually made very clear that there are a range of solutions for how to address this in terms of inclusive governance, including promoting the participation of marginalized groups or underrepresented groups in decision making, and improving their access to resources and services, and very happy to go into that more in the discussion. But there are case studies to build on, and there's progress that can be made kind of for a more inclusive approach, both now and in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Nina. Aaron, over to you. Bring us home with your provocation.
Okay. I think I might be a little bit closer to the doom side. But, I'll try and not. So my background's in earth system science, as you said, Laurie, and I've always tried to stick close to the science as a guide, because I think we need to do that. So for me, real hope comes from confronting reality and taking a bare assessment of the facts and going forwards with our eyes open. Because if we keep the rose-tinted spectacles on, we're not going to do what's required. So for me, that's the starting point. There was a famous quote by John Schellenhuber, who was the head of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impacts, who was also an earth system scientist, and he said, I think quite correctly, that political reality must be grounded in physical reality, or else it's completely useless. And unfortunately, at the moment, we have a situation where political reality and physical reality are drifting further and further apart, if you look at the rhetoric that we're seeing in the COP process and so on. So we know we're in a state of planetary emergency. That's what the science is telling us. And that's not just rhetoric, it's not just hyperbole. You know, if you think about it scientifically, what it means is that the reaction time, which is our time left to respond to the crisis, is now getting much closer to the remaining intervention time in the system if we're to try and stop tipping points from being triggered in the Earth system. And that's work that Tim Lenton and others at the Global Systems Institute have done. So if we're in an emergency, what we need is an emergency response. I think that's the message of the science, that's the message from me to you today. But despite 30 years of warnings from the scientific community, emissions keep going up, and they're still, concentrations still going up exponentially. The question we all should be asking is why, right? That's the question. I think if we're looking at where we're headed, fossil fuel investments are going up. Production is predicted to continue to rise. So for a 1.5 degree C carbon budget, we need to halve fossil fuel production by 2030. But current policies are putting it to be 16% higher in 2030. We're still headed in the wrong direction. That's the reality that we must face. So, you know, what we're talking about is leaving 90% of coal reserves in the ground. We're talking about leaving 60% of oil and gas reserves in the ground if we're to remain within our carbon budget for 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is why it's looking increasingly likely that we will overshoot it. We will not stay within that budget. But the UK and other countries are continuing to license for more fossil fuel exploration to increase this carbon bubble that we're building and building. That's the reality. So, you know, there's two ways of thinking about that. Either the markets have already priced in the harm, and they've already, you know, that's just there, or something's gone incredibly wrong in the way that we're valuing risk and assessing risk about the future. And I think what's happened is that the short-termism of the financial system, of the political system, has basically blinded us to the risks that we're walking to rapidly. So this is what I think Baroness Bryony Worthington has called the tragedy of the incumbents. You know, we have got a situation that we are not taking the action that we need because those vested interests who already have the power in society are basically thwarting climate action. I think the UN Secretary General said this really clearly this week when he said, you know, we seem trapped in a world where fossil fuel producers and financiers have humanity by the throat. That's a direct quote. So for realistic hope, we need to develop a politics that can confront those vested interests, that can build a counterpower to the power of those vested interests, and challenge the fossil fuel economy. So that means breaking with the modes of thinking that have kind of determined what is politically possible or what is considered realpolitik. And instead, you know, we need to have a transformative vision of what politics can deliver. We need to have a World War II scale mobilization in order to transition our economy. And that's going to require politics where we have mass public engagement and mass public pressure in order to create positive social tipping points, which you also talked about, Laurie. So I think if we're thinking in that mindset, which I think is the reality of the scale of the challenge that we face, then we need to look at a response similar to, you know, those of wartime, similar to those of our response to the COVID pandemic, where everything changes very, very rapidly. We know that governments can do that once we treat things as an emergency. We have not been treating the climate crisis as an emergency, and we really, really need to.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Right, I would like to get us having a conversation here. I'd like to frame that in a couple of ways. Get some questions going, and our fully qualified roving mic operators will come around to you. Before you put your hands up, as all of you I know are about to, there's a couple of ways I want to frame this. The first is to take one of the points that you were making, Aaron, about how there's a drift, a cleavage between the political reality and then the scientific reality of there being a planetary emergency, right? My question generally to the room, or something for us to mull over as we have a discussion, is how can we, A, ensure that emergency response comes to bear and is accelerated, while also ensuring, B, it is not derailed by the increasingly severe consequences of the failure to have delivered emergency response so far. So that's something I'd like to have in mind. The second thing is that if that's a very large systemic thing, I'd like to bring it down to the personal level and prompt people to think, well, it can be like riding a horse or on a bike on a very bumpy landscape. It can be easy to tip over in one direction towards our kind of hysterical hopium if we've cast it here, or over the other side into a kind of fatalistic doomism. So I would be interested in people's reflections or questions relating to more the personal emotional, psychological challenge of ensuring that we don't slip in either direction and we're able to stay at the course and accelerate a transition under these conditions. So hands up, any questions or comments you'd like to share with our fantastic panel? Over to you. Got one just down here. And if you could give your name and where you're vaguely coming from today, please.
I'm Peterhurst. I'm a member of Chatham House, live in Cheshire. One of the two things that struck me recently is that one, as we come out of COVID, people have wanted to go back on their foreign holidays and fly. And the second one is that you could argue that the curtailing of energy supplies would be an excuse to do more in the renewable field. And I wonder why, those are not being carried out. And I noticed that the gentleman there, I think, talked about trust or faith, and they're not quite the same thing. And also inclusivity. And I think that civil society, in a way, has to drive this. And for that, there needs to be education. But I know this is a think tank, but I find there's too much thinking.
Not enough tanking.
Is there a space for, the nearest we can get is our religious leaders who believe in something other than our little brains working things out? Is there a scope for enlarging the conversation that includes people from religious and spiritual areas to help tackle this common problem?
Great, thank you very much. So anyone on the panel who's interested in going for that, I'm going to slightly run with that point as well, and just and throw in there more your point about a kind of a moment of crisis could and should have led to rapid changes in some of the areas that you just described. I'd be interested in panelists' reflections and others on how we maximize the potential in moments of chaos. We have seen in history that chaotic moments, fractures in how society is performing, have led to rapid changes. Doesn't feel like it's happening right now. So we'll take gentleman's question and also that point there about how we do drive rapid changes in moments of crisis. Who would like to go first? Jesse, is that you? You're spoiling for it. Come on. I can see.
Sure, I'll give this a shot. These thoughts might be a bit scattered, and hopefully we'll come together towards something. It's, from my perspective, both personally and speaking in a professional capacity, to the extent that we are indeed facing a climate emergency, then we must keep an eye on we must have all hands on deck, or all tools on the table, whichever metaphor one prefers. Because of course, not all greenhouse gas emissions come from the use of fossil fuels. I forgot the figure, it's a majority, but not all. There's of course other sources of fossil fuels, industrial processes, concrete, production, agriculture, etc. And as I was emphasizing, there's other means to reduce climate risks, adaptation, carbon removal, and perhaps sunlight reflection. And I often am struck by those that are most concerned about the emergency characteristic of the climate challenge to often be somewhat resistant towards considering a wider array of options to address that emergency. And I see that as an underlying tension. And the second of two things that I'll say, as we look beyond the necessity, of course, to phase out the use of fossil fuels and transition to a new economy, is that at the international level, the political dynamics are, of course, much more complex. In the global south, where the risks of climate change are much more significant, they are confronted with the challenge that some of these countries produce very small shares of greenhouse gas emissions, and economic development remains a high priority for them. So from their eyes, not only is adaptation, for example, a potential additional approach towards climate risk, it can be a primary means to reduce climate risk. And there, of course, international finance becomes a very tricky, difficult conversation.
I think it ultimately comes down to the fact that we need to hold our political leaders accountable, and we're not doing that. And if we look at what happened with COVID, I mean, COVID was a tremendous emergency because it affected each and every one of us. All of us, ended up staying home or having virtual education. It was a global problem, but somehow the actions that should have been taken before COVID really became a global emergency were not taken. And the warning signs were there, and we've been talking about the risk of a pandemic for many years. It's the same thing with climate change. We know what the impact is, and the voices that are really very vocal in the COP processes are those that are living this as a daily experience, those that are on the front lines of the small island developing states, living in coastal communities. Their voices are very, very vocal in these COP processes, but the rest of us still see it as something a little bit removed from our daily existence. We may experience extreme weather events every once in a while. There are floods in Germany that, of course, are shocking to everyone, but it's not part yet of, I think, our really daily existence. And so it's a little bit hard, I think, for us to make it the political issue that it needs to be. And I think back to the last US elections, in which climate change was listed as the 7th most important issue in the minds of US voters. So it was pretty far down the list. I think that this is something that we have seen for decades when it comes to disaster risk reduction. There is a short-termism when it comes to political leadership as well as financial markets. And it's really only, I believe, when the financial community really steps up and understands both the direct and indirect impacts and starts to put measures into place to ensure that they are not held accountable, like the insurance industry, for example, that we're going to start to see some change. But we really need to hold our leaders more accountable than we're currently doing.
Some other thoughts on that if you want, but are there any more questions that we've got? We've got one just down the front there.
Just out of interest, I'm just wondering, coming back on the point about you mentioned that it's the financial sector that will really help to turn the key in helping to make people more accountable. But what about, I know the Dutch people have taken their government to court in terms of, what about more legal cases like that? Would that help make governments more accountable? Would that help at all? Would that make any more impact?
Some points here in person. Aaron, did you want to go?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think that would really help. It's definitely been a really powerful signal. There was also
It's kind of disappeared though, because once that decision was made, there was no more there wasn't anything else that came out of it. It happened, the decision happened, but nothing else happened after that. There's no other impact.
So, as far as I know, the Dutch government were forced to re-evaluate their climate mitigation plan and had to produce a new one that was then legally required by the courts. There's also been other cases, including in Holland, where they've successfully sued Shell to align its business strategy, and that had, again, potentially major implications that's currently in appeal. But I think those kind of law cases could be really important. But again, I think they typically reflect a wider shift in society. The law follows where culture is, in a sense, in those regards. But I think one of the things that I really want to stress, going back to this thing around crisis as well, is, we know what the solutions to the crisis is. The IPCC report sets out that the third working group is absolutely full of them. It's not that we don't know what the solutions to the crisis is. It's not even that it's more expensive to do it. Actually, the IPCC is really clear on that too. It's cheaper to go for the sustainable route. It's what's preventing us from doing that is not lack of information, and it's not lack of solutions, and it's not lack of necessarily even awareness. I think it's the fact that we have basically got a kind of a corporate capture of government by the vested interests. And what we've seen in the latest crisis with the Ukraine and things is that the fossil fuel industry was straight out the door saying we need to increase fossil fuel production. They had all of that, their rhetoric lined up, and they were very quick to kind of go and start lobbying politicians to say we need to increase production, we need to increase licensing, etc. What we needed and what we need is to have the counterpower to that, which is basically going to be mass movements, in my view, to say to governments, no, that's not the way we're going to go. We have the solutions. We're going to decarbonise. That's what we need to do. And we need to double down on, for example, energy demand reduction, which in the UK, there's just a new report out. We could reduce energy demand in the UK 52% whilst having no decline in quality of life in the UK. That's the kind of thinking, out-of-the-box thinking that we need.
So this is kind of like you could think of a number of deficits that need to be closed in society, right? Often people focus on the so-called information deficit, where if more people know about the problem, the environmental crisis, then an action will then inevitably follow. And more disasters and more shocks closes organically that information deficit. But what I'm hearing here is that it doesn't necessarily lead to change, closing the information deficit. It doesn't even necessarily lead to change if you close what you could call the salience deficit, where it's not just raw facts and figures, it's then really speaks to people's values and so on. And instead, we need to be in a situation, I think you're arguing there, and we're hearing here, that we need to close the power deficit. And that's important for making change now, but it's particularly important for ensuring that rapid change can be made in moments of crisis, where the envelope for opportunity for change is opened up even more. Did you want to come in with any thoughts before we then come back out?
Yeah, just a couple of responses to different points that were made. I think I really agree with what Aaron's been saying, and I think building on that in terms of the different deficits, I can see there is some sort of deficit between the knowledge of the solutions in the IPCC report, which is obviously an incredibly long, detailed and quite technical report, to a quite holistic, bold and positive political vision that brings that together and is seen as like an alternative, like a realistic alternative that people can rally behind both in elections and on the streets. I mean, obviously there's things like the Green New Deal and also the feminist Green New Deal and many initiatives like that, which I think are sort of steps in that direction, but actually bringing political momentum around that kind of alternative, I mean, I think can also help to bridge this whole doomism thing when it's not just hope based on nothing, it's actually a realistic, positive plan going forward. And I think related to that, I think it's important to highlight multiple wins in terms of how this is relevant to people's lives. And, for example, removing fossil fuel subsidies and reinvesting it in community social development, something like that. Even if you maybe don't actually care that much about fossil fuel subsidies, you might care about, money going into your community. So making sure that it's kind of holistic in that sense. And I think in response to what Loretta said, I think there is actually a bit of an information deficit in countries like the UK in terms of how serious the climate change impacts are now affecting countries in the global south. I think there's actually a really big gap in coverage, for example, of like the heat waves in South Asia recently and things like that. And not just that they're happening, but how serious they are and how they're attributed to climate change. I think there is actually a gap there that bridging that could actually help to build solidarity with the most affected communities, which would help to mobilize more urgent action now as well.
And a lot of the scientists in the growing field of attribution studies that make those connections, that said, for example, that the heat waves we've seen in India and Pakistan recently are made 30 times more likely because of the climate crisis. they are also saying we shouldn't just focus on those extreme shocks. We should focus on what Loretta was saying, the high frequency, low intensity events at a local level that are this grinding process of destabilization and wearing down in communities. And that, I agree with you, is often also missed from the conversation. It's the big blowout. It's the destruction of the Canadian township of Lytton, and it's not the cascading impacts that happen in the 6 months after that. Let's get some more from the audience. We had one down here. We're going to take a cluster, okay? Now we've got a few. So one just here in the middle, and then we'll take the two that popped up just over here, and then we'll come back to the panel with those three. So over to you, please.
Great. So I'm Freya Roberts. I work for the UCL Climate Action Unit. I think one deficit we haven't talked about, or that the panel hasn't talked about yet, is the deficit in people knowing how to do something about it. And it also relates to your point earlier, Laurie, about how do we capitalise in that moment of crisis and chaos? What do we do in that moment to get people to the point that where they're acting is, so the work that my team does is really about telling stories of how people are doing things on climate change, because we kind of need examples to show us how to address. So in those moments of chaos, I want a politician to say how we can do something, or I want my organisation, or I want a person to demonstrate to me the way that things can be done, the how, and that's the how is a major deficit, really, because I think people are really aware that of the risks, the science, whether they choose to kind of engage with it or not. But often people are just stuck because they don't know how to do anything about it, and that's a massive gap we've got to fill. We've got to stop telling people to 4 decimal points how much hotter it's getting per decade, and start telling them, like, here's what your neighbour did when they tried to retrofit their garage, or put triple glazing. Here's how they navigated the Green Grant Scheme, because those are the kind of tangible things that you can give people in the moment when they're struck by fear. Give them something like that they can use, not more scary facts. So yeah, any thoughts on the kind of deficit of how would be interesting.
That's brilliant. I really like that. And there's often an analogy I've seen drawn with the Second World War, and how when that crisis kicked off, decision makers didn't say, we've got a target to phase out Nazism in 20 years' time, and we'll do it with some kind of anti-Nazi tax. Can we go the row back and then the one in front, please?
Hi, yeah. I thought it was very interesting that you mentioned Lytton. So I'm from Vancouver Island, grew up there, lived my whole life, and the last 5 years, it's been quite aware in not just Vancouver Island, but the whole province, just how much climate change has affected the province itself. I think in the last 5 years, especially during COVID, we went from, pandemic emergency, and then we had like 5 other emergencies all related to the environment and forest fires, the heat dome that occurred. I wasn't too far away from Lytton when that burnt down. And there's definitely an awareness within the province that, climate change is occurring. It's our food prices there were going up quite a bit after the wildfires that were happening in California and in the province. And there's a lot of action being done locally. However, there's also a very big issue with the governments and the lobbying. So over and over again, we seem to be no longer electing governments that aren't putting climate change on their agenda. For a while now in British Columbia as well, they've been electing more left-wing, more progressive governments to tackle these issues, but it's still, there's not enough being done in the province, and it seems as well from people I know that work in the government that there's still a lot of, in the background, money from big fossil fuel companies and logging companies to stop these actions. So I think as much as the awareness is there of the people and their voting right, it's just that there's this blockage from that. So how do we deal with those sort of things?
Okay, that is great. Thank you. So I'm gonna kind of tack that onto the one before. There's the action deficit, capitalizing on moments of chaos. There's then also the power blockages in moments of chaos. So let's take the last of those 3 questions, if it's still there, in the row just in front, just here.
I'm Reem, I'm a student at the LSE, and my question was sort of drawing on your point about the impact of environmental regulations on smaller businesses, and whether you think that there is a blanket approach at all that we can use when it comes to environmental regulations, especially when it comes to things like energy, where those regulations really do impact smaller businesses, and equally, whether you think that there is a sort of hypocritical element where developing countries don't have to have to adhere to environmental regulations or environmental standards that, say, the West, when we were developing, didn't have to adhere to as well. And actually, whether you think that the sort of transparency with the information deficit, whether transparency would actually support that, and whether consumers sort of voting with their dollar, so to speak, would actually impact the way that businesses act.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, over to the panel. We've got that one just there on environmental regulation, differences between North and South, and then I'm going to lump the two before into how we deal with a lack of awareness of what people can do in a moment of crisis themselves, being given that agency down to the individual level, and then also unblocking those kind of power dynamics. Who's got some thoughts that can cut across some of those areas? Who would like to go? Loretta, is that you volunteering?
Well, it's maybe not answering directly those comments, which were all really excellent questions, but I think it's more of a reflection of what we're actually experiencing. We saw Western countries come together very quickly when Russia invaded Ukraine because they recognized that there was a real and immediate threat. They mobilized billions of dollars and are continuing to mobilize billions of dollars in response to this threat. Same thing with COVID. I mean, COVID was an immediate threat. And the challenge we have with climate change is that it is not a threat in the immediate nature. They do not perceive it as a threat immediately like this. And so it's a much more diffuse threat over a longer, term that needs to be taken into account. And even, if I may say, that mortality rates from extreme weather events, including climate-induced, have decreased. And they've decreased because of better preparedness and early warning. So that sense of like people are going to die overnight because of climate change isn't something that is actually in the forefront of the minds of the decision makers right now. And I think we need new approaches to really, and that's why I keep coming back to these financial impacts. What we are seeing through extreme weather events is an increase in economic losses over time. That is actually going to fundamentally impact the socioeconomic, I would say, well-being, especially of the developing world. So Western countries in particular, they have the ability to act quickly. We have seen it with Ukraine and COVID, but we're not yet, I think, approaching this in a way that really is spurring that immediate action. So we need to think a little bit more about how to do that.
You wanted to come in?
Yeah, I wanted to come in on Freya's question, which I thought was really important and something I've been trying to work out the solution to myself. I think I've also really identified this gap, especially among young people who are looking at this, who are well informed about climate change but feel very powerless. I think we see that individual action on climate change is being promoted as a solution. Say, for example, in the UK context, and we also know that that's not necessarily the most effective approach, although, for things like energy demand reduction, that's still important, but it's not the main solution, in my opinion. I think that a key gap is kind of making a clear set of demands politically in terms of systemic solutions and making that really accessible and bringing people on board so that they can channel their negative feelings of fear about climate change and all that information they have into some kind of concrete political asks. But I mean, if I may, I'm curious to ask you if this is something you're working on. What are the barriers that you're finding in terms of filling this gap of telling stories and sharing examples, and so people know how to do something about it? Is it that like practitioners aren't actually sharing their ideas, or?
I think in our experiences that there's a lot of communication on kind of the risks and addressing a perceived information deficit, that if people just know more about climate change, then they'll do something. And trying to shift people to the practice of talking about what you can do and how you can do it, and giving examples of how people have struggled through it in their professional circumstance, or how they've made it part of their role or part of their institution. So it's a cultural shift for people working in this space to not need to continually present the science, which fundamentally has not changed at all, and instead go, what messaging does work for people, what gets them to action, like not what gets them informed, but what actually gets them to action. So we're kind of working with different kind of groups, so it'd be like local authorities to share case studies of where they've struggled and succeeded to bring about a climate action plan, or institutions, or the National Trust, any kind of large organisations, about talking much more about the issue in a way that encourages others to act and give people like the how and the story of the struggle, because it's going to be a struggle. We're not, this is a wicked problem. We're not going to crack it with like a swap A for B, but knowing that other people are doing it and have succeeded, that's a really powerful motivational tool, but it's not the kind of mainstream that we're encountering.
Can I get, and before Aaron, you come in, and then Jesse, it'd be good to get some final thoughts from you. I'd like to just throw this out there that this from like a deeper systemic perspective is crucial, right? We had mutual aid societies pop up in the context of COVID. There was an astonishing opportunity there, presumably for governments to act in a way in which they could have taken that energy that was organically emerging on the grassroots level, that collective feeling, and run with it. And often in the UK, we tell this story of these big paradigmatic changes in how society was governed that came from moments of crisis. After the Second World War, with the creation of a lot of our welfare state here, with the National Health Service, our socialised healthcare system, and then again after the crisis in the 1970s, ones that are in some ways similar, related to the crises we experience today with energy, say, which then led to a turn more towards a focus on markets as a driving power force in the economy. There are these opportunities for big moments of change out of crisis, and we seem to have not really exploited that now. That's one I would like to throw out there. Aaron, maybe it's something you'll pick up on, and then Jesse, it'd be good to get your final thoughts. Over to you.
Yeah, okay. I think just gathering my thoughts. So I think we are thinking about like sharing best practice and looking for examples where things are happening. I think there are examples in all of these disruptions that we've been going through recently where there have been really interesting, bold policy shifts in different countries. Where, I'm thinking, just this week we've just heard that Spain is reducing fares on all public transport by a third to a half in order to try and reduce demand for fuel. That's a climate solution. It's also a solution to the crisis of the energy crisis. It's also a solution to issues of injustice and how to, provide equitable access to transport. There's an interesting example in Holland where, again, they've just mandated that we're going to have heat pumps installed in all new developments. Those kind of bold thinking. France is another good example where they've just announced that there won't be any internal flights within a 2-hour radius. Right? That's a climate solution that we just aren't even talking about in the UK at the moment. We're actually reducing costs of flight duty. So I think that there are interesting solutions out there that are being deployed in response to different crises. And I think one of the key things is what you were saying, Nina, is linking these issues intersectionally to say, we are proposing bold actions to fix lots of different issues, not just climate change, but that drives the climate agenda forwards. And so I think that's I think the co-benefits is absolutely key to how we can address this and build that positive political message.
Thanks, Aaron. Jesse, over to you. Any final thoughts?
Yes, a word on domestic politics and a word on international politics. Domestically speaking, the fact remains that a significant share of voters prioritize the issues that are most salient to them, those that have the most direct and the most short-term impacts. Climate change, as well as many other environmental issues, are particularly challenging because the impacts are largely in the future in other parts of the world. So it becomes difficult about how to motivate. I think if there's one place where lessons can be learned from, I think that those of you in the United Kingdom deserve a nice pat on the back. The case can be made that the United Kingdom has had the most successful emissions reduction policy, certainly in the industrialized world and arguably in the world. And looking at how that worked across the conservative and the Labour parties is interesting. I think it's important to not pretend that these responses will be costless and widely accepted. To shift beyond climate change, I live in the Netherlands, where we have a nitrogen crisis, and the government's decided that the nitrogen must be reduced, the various forms of nitrogen pollution, by a dramatic amount, and that farms, which are a leading source of nitrogen, will need to be reduced in numbers. And we now have farmers who are blocking the highways this week, every day, forming a new political party, etc., which may have long-term impacts on the politics. So it's a very challenging path forward. And at the international front, the complexities are just as great, if not more so, where historical greenhouse gas emissions have largely occurred in the minority of countries that are industrialized, that are growing most rapidly in developing countries. And it creates this very serious fissure, and at a time where international trust and cooperation appears to be lower than it used to be. So it's a treacherous terrain in front of us.
Stop us there. We are over time. I'd like us to give a round of applause to our fantastic panel, to Loretta, to Jessie, to Nina, and to Aaron. Thank you very much for joining us, particularly Jessie and Loretta, who are online. I would urge you to go and check out their work at the Commission, the Global Commission on Overshoot, to read the Global Assessment Report from the UNDRR, and then to check out the work of Aaron and Nina, who you can follow on Twitter. I mean, I think everyone here is on Twitter. You follow me. I would urge you to go and check out the Cohort 2040 project that I'm running, cohort2040.org, which is looking at how those who are entering mid-career can be supported to drive a faster transition under greater destabilization, how we can do that more effectively, how we can exploit moments of crisis. For those of us who are in the room upstairs now, and sorry, Loretta and Jessie, you're going to miss out on this, there is a simulation about to start, a participatory simulation where you take on the role of a mayor in a small town in a Southeast Asian country, and you'll be facing an incoming typhoon during an election week. How will you prepare for the disaster risk, and what will it mean for your electoral chances? It's almost as if we scheduled this to happen right after this, subject to what we're talking about this event. There is then a drinks reception here, and we would urge you all as friends of Chatham House to stay around, enjoy a drink, and have a chat with our speakers here. We're sorry we don't have you there, Loretta and Jessie. Thanks to you all for your questions, for your thoughts, and for coming today, and we'll see you soon. Thank you very much.